All right, we are on notes D of the quadratic formula. And so in notes D, when we look at the first column, the graph here, I've completed this already because we've done this multiple times in notes B and note C. So what we did is I had my equation x squared plus 2x minus 3. I found my axis of symmetry, my vertex, and used an XY chart in order to graph my quadratic, my parabola. From there, I'm able to note my x-intercepts and my y-intercepts. And note there are two solutions. So we are, at this point, very good at doing our graphs. So next thing we need to do is when we don't have a graph handy, can we find the x-intercepts and y-intercepts by just using our equation? So whenever you want to find the x-intercept, we are going to set y equals 0. And when you want to find the y-intercept, we're going to set x equals 0. Okay, that is good information to always know. So if we want to find the x-intercepts, we need y equals 0. And I need to solve for x. This is not something we have learned how to do yet. We are going to learn that today using the quadratic formula. But we can solve for the y-intercept by setting x equals to 0. And y equals to negative 3. This goes along the concept of negative 3, right? That's the same thing as my c value. So let's work on using the quadratic formula to solve for x. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I also linked a couple of fancy songs for you to help remember the quadratic formula. Okay, so we're going to go down here and we are going to solve for the quadratic formula. So we have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if we identify what a, b, and c are from our equation, that will help us. So now we're going to substitute in the information we know. So we have negative 2 plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So what we do next is we're always going to solve what's under the quadratic, or what's under the square root first. So we have the square root, and we're going to do 2 squared in our head. So 4 minus 4 times 1 times negative 3. We're going to put that in our calculators, and we get 4. Okay, so we do what's under the square root first, and we have 4. So now I'm going to rewrite my equation, x equals to negative 2 plus or minus 4 over 2. Now this plus or minus here is going to give us 2 answers. So we have x equals negative 2 plus 4 divided by 2, and x equals negative 2 minus 4 divided by 2. So this plus or minus, right, gives us these 2 different answers. So now we're going to solve. We have 2 over 2 equals to 1, and x equals negative 6 over 2, which equals to negative 3. So we're able to find our solutions, or our x values, by using the quadratic formula. And you can compare, let's get a different color here, but you can compare these values, right, are the same as what we found from our graph. But we can also find these numbers without graphing, is the point of the quadratic formula. All right, let's take a look at number 2. So I'm going to go right to the quadratic formula. So let's rewrite the quadratic formula. It helps to write it a bunch just so you can memorize it. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we'll identify a, b, and c. And we're going to rewrite our equation then using our variables. So I have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. All right. So my first step is going to be to do what's underneath the radical sign or the square root sign. So negative 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times 1 times 16. And I'm going to put that in my calculator. And we get 0. All right, so then we are going to say x equals a negative 8 is positive 8 plus or minus 0 all over 2. So when you have plus or minus 0 here, this means I'm going to only have one solution. Right? So we end up with x equals 8 divided by 2, which equals to 4. So my solution is just one solution. And if you look at our graph here that was already done for us, right? Oh, that went crazy. So if we look at our graph here, right, we just have one solution at x equals 4. All right, next example. We write the quadratic formula, x equals to negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We'll identify a, b, and c. So we have x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We're going to do what's underneath the square root sign first. So we have the square root of 16 minus 4 times 1 times 10. Put that in our calculator. And we're going to get an error because it's trying to take the square root of a negative 24, and we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So when we get a error on our calculator, what does that mean? That means we have no solutions. And that's our answer, no solutions. So if I look at my graph, right, my no solutions, it matches up because my graph also never crosses my x-axis. All right, let's do the next example here. So we're going to use our quadratic formula again. And we want to identify A, B, and C. The key to this problem is making sure that you identify B equals to 0. So we have x equals to 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. we are going to continue to do our first step is what's under the square root sign. So the square root of 0 minus 4 times negative 9. We're going to put that in our calculator. And we get 12. All right, so we're going to take that 12 and we're going to go x equals to 0 plus or minus 12 over 8. So we are going to have two answers because we have the plus or minus. So x is going to equal to 0 plus 12 divided by 8, and x is going to equal 0 minus 12 divided by 8. So x equals 12 over 8, which equals to 3 halves. And x is equal to negative 12 over 8, which equals to negative 3 halves. So we look at our graph again that we can compare to. And when we come up here, we note, right, that these intercepts are not exact. Right? And using the quadratic formula is how I can find the exact answer instead of estimating. All right, I'm going to go through these last three examples with you. So, they're going to be the same exact process. So A equals to 2, B equals to 0, and C equals to negative 10. We're going to put these into the quadratic equation. B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. My first step that I'm going to do is calculate what's under the square root sign. Zero minus 4 times 2 times negative 10 is going to equal 8.94. So now in my equation I have x is equal to 0 plus or minus 8.94 divided by 4. And you are going to get a lot of decimals when you do the quadratic equation. Now this is going to give me two answers. X equals to 0 plus 8.94 divided by 4. And x is equal to 0 minus 8.94 divided by 4. So we have 8.94 divided by 4. So we have 2.235 positive and negative 2.235. Okay, so that's number one. Okay, so number two, in order to do the quadratic equation, we have to get this in standard form. So I have to get everything on the side, one side of the equal sign. Then I can define my A, B, and C properly. You cannot do it unless you have everything on one side of the equal sign. Then we're going to set up our quadratic formula. So negative 4 plus or minus square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so same process that we've been doing. We're going to do what's under the square root sign first. So we have 16 minus 4 times negative 5 times negative 3 equals. So let's put that in our calculators. You get an error or a non-real result, right? So that means we have no solution. So for number 2, we have no solution. Okay, our last example, number 3. We have to get everything on one side of the equal sign. Then I can identify A, B, and C. And fill in my quadratic formula. So we have -4 plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. We are going to do what's underneath the square root sign first. So we have the square root of 16 minus 4 times -2 times -2. And we get that to equal 0. So now I'm going to rewrite my quadratic. I have 4, +4, plus or minus 0, divided by -4. And remember, when this is 0, we get one solution, which equals to 4 divided by -4, which equals to -1. All right, so your homework for today is going to be IXL. Make sure I say the right IXL number, and it is going to be IXL BB11, which is all on the quadratic formula.